All right, good evening. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight on this cold night. Appreciate you being here. My name is Scott Tappett. I'm the assistant to the Dean of the College of Letters and Science. I work in a media role, maybe appropriate for tonight's discussion. Also with event planning and things of that nature. I'm also responsible for putting together the community lecture series that you're here tonight for. And before I introduce you to our speaker tonight, I'd like to direct you to the brochure and just let you know about our next speaker. December 10th is Professor Dr. David Berry, who's graced us with his presence here tonight. Professor Berry will be speaking on understanding society through science fiction. So get that on your calendar for the second Tuesday in December. Looking forward to that. But tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Saemyi Park. She's a professor in our Department of Political Science, and reading a little bit about her. She got her BA and MA in Political Science and International Relations from Sukkyung Women's University in South Korea, an MA in International Communication from American University in Washington, D.C., and her PhD in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And tonight, Dr. Park will be presenting the role of media in a healthy democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, a nice round of applause for Dr. Saemyi.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me tonight, and thanks for coming to the talk despite the cold weather. Great turnout. I'm so impressed. Thank you very much. I do teach normally classes in American politics, but my one of research interests is mostly centered on race and ethnicity. But my teaching interest is about media and public opinion in elections. So tonight I'm going to introduce about one of the most hot button issues today, media. And but I have more specific title, a role of media in a healthy democracy. In recent years, I have many students in my classes, and they're saying that I hate media, or I don't trust media. There's too many fake news. They are inaccurate. I hate it. And those reactions and responses have certain reasons why they have their reaction against the media. But in order to have that feeling, as an informed citizen, we better have better knowledge about what kind of media role there is and normally expected in a healthy democracy, and what kind of influence the media does to our opinions. So let me introduce the definition of the democracy first. We are living in a representative democracy. We as voters, we elect the leaders and who will make a government policy and enact those policies in line with my own interest. So I elect the president, I elect the congressman, right? And we do not elect the people in judiciary branch directly, but we want to make sure that the better judge who could interpret the Constitution and apply it to the controversial issues are appointed and confirmed by President and the Congress, right? And when we say healthy democracy, we could say that if we have known which candidate or which party is better represent my interests, and we are able to elect them, then we could say that we achieve fair representation. Then key assumption in this argument is that we know that which party or which candidates can better represent my interest. Then where do we get that information? We are so busy with our lives. We have our own job, so we can't not go around and find information, right? We should rely on something else. That's the media. Media sources is the most important primary channel that we could gain the information about which candidate or which political parties are the better representative for my own interest. Then question is, what if the information we gain is inaccurate? What if the information we got is biased? And the reaction these days my students express is because they thought the media is biased. They thought the media, the information they gain from that channel is somewhat inaccurate. And are those feelings accurate? Are those feelings valid? In order to answer that question, we need to dissect what kind of media we are talking about. When I ask my students, where do you get information about politics or society? Mostly they do not talk about those type of media channels. The traditional media like local news or magazine or newspapers or radio hardly mentioned in my Poly 101 classes. Or some of them says cable, like CNN or Fox News cable TV, but many of them do not have cables in their dormitory or their home, right? Instead, they talk about social media. It's a primary information sources for younger generations. The biggest differences between traditional media, new media, and the social media is that in the traditional media, this is more likely one-way direction, that journalists, very few numbers of journalists provide information to the large number of the public, right? And new media says that the information is available 24 hours to us. And social media is completely different kind of platform. We as voters, we are not only audience of the news sources, we are also contributor of the information. We share the information and we also create the information, so we become an important partner in that information channel. And the rise of social media raised concerns among many Americans. There is pros and cons. First of all, there is greater accessibility to all sorts of information. So that's good, right? It used to be in the traditional media, very few numbers of them, and it's somewhat limited. But now we have greater access to the information. But at the same time, people are concerned about its accuracy, its quality. So many people were concerned about that nowadays media is problematic, is biased. There are some issues with media. But when we answer that questions, we need to be clear of what kind of media we are talking about and how media influence our opinions and whether or not media is literally biased or no. And if it is biased, then in what ways? And then we also need to understand how we consume different media sources and channels. So tonight I'm going to explain about media effects and media bias and how we consume media. So let me start with the media effects. When people were concerned about media bias or media in general, we assume that media will influence our opinion, right? But how? First of all, we need to understand the role of media. Journalists will play two important roles. As a gatekeeper, they kind of decide what is newsworthy and what is not. They are not covering every kind of story. They decide what kind of story the public should know and what story is not newsworthy. So as a gatekeeper, they open the gates for certain important issues and they close the door if it is not newsworthy. Investigative reporters is a kind of traditional role that we expect from the journalist, like a watchdog. And we, as ordinary people, do not have access to government or corporations or other entities. Instead, journalists have that access. So as a watchdog, they are finding any wrongdoings by corporation or government or important politicians. Those are very important roles played by journalists. In order to perform gatekeeping roles or watchdog roles, they should engage in certain types of ways to present the news story to the public by agenda setting, by priming, or framing. So let me introduce each of those terms. So political communication scholars, they said that journalists are engaged in agenda setting. What does that mean? It's like a gatekeeping. So if it is newsworthy, they cover it. If it is not newsworthy to the public, they do not cover it. So by doing it, they set the national agenda for the public. So it's kind of really intuitive. Like when dogs bite Dr. Park, it's happened all the time. Dogs bite people sometimes, right? But if Dr. Park bites a dog, that's pretty odd. It's newsworthy, isn't it, right? So probably some of journalists, local news channel will cover it, like university professor bites a dog, right? Newsworthy. And that's agenda setting. We are only available to certain types of news that is determined by journalists who play as a gatekeeper. That's agenda setting. What is priming? When news are presented to us, certain aspects of it were emphasized. It is primed, it is emphasized by the journalist. So we can use it as, oh, this is a very complex issue, and I could understand it in that way, which is primed and emphasized by journalists. Especially this priming effects happen during the election when we make a vote choice on certain candidates. So how could I make my decision for which candidate I should vote for? Certain aspects of a candidate is primed. That's priming. Framing is how story is presented to us. And many issues are very controversial and complex. It's multifaceted. And the journalists decided to frame the issue in a certain way so that audience can better understand and easily understand about complex issues. That's framing. Okay, those definitions, which is not quite, you could understand the definitions, then I will give you an example, okay? So it's a kind of a little Q&A session, so you can actually answer that question if you know the answer. November 2015, like 4 years ago, probably many of you remember, maybe all of you remember what happened in Paris, France, right? And not only American media, but entire globe was in shock because the terrorist attack in Paris. Right? And those are the front page of so many different papers. Okay? And so, November 2015, so many Americans shared their sadness, and they changed the Facebook profile photos with French flag, like Mark Zuckerberg did. So you kind of show that, oh, we're so in shock, and we want to share our solidarity. Right? However, not many people know about a day before the Paris attack, there was a similar attack by similar terrorist organization in Beirut, Lebanon. The casualty was much severe in there. 44 people died and more than 200 people were seriously wounded. But why it wasn't covered? Right? And there's tons of reasons why it wasn't covered. But I'm asking you, which kind of media influence this example is describing? Can anyone answer that? Yes?
Is it agenda setting?
It's agenda setting. Excellent.
I took your class.
Oops, that's a secret. So yes, it's agenda setting, right? And there's another reason why Western media focus on French Paris attack, not Beirut attacks. However, because journalists in the United States didn't cover the Beirut attacks, there's no way that we could know about it. It's agenda setting. There is another example that I would like to give you. 2016, the state of South Carolina decided to take the Confederate flag from their state capital. But many of them support it as a way of healing, but quite many people also opposed to it. They believe that this is a Confederate flag is a kind of the heritage, not a symbol of racism. So there was a huge protest in South Carolina. So when you live in South Carolina or in neighboring states, you probably watched two different versions of a story. One emphasized that those protests rally is very disturbing to social order. Could be very dangerous because it will ignite the counter rally or protest against it. Another version could emphasize civil liberties guaranteed in the First Amendment. It's a freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Theoretically, if you watch both versions, that would be perfect because you can have a complete picture of it. But most Americans don't. You stick with the one channel than the other, right? So what this example explain, which media influence do you think? From among agenda setting, framing, priming, what do you think? Yeah, I heard that. I heard the answer.
Framing.
Yes, framing, right? And this protest could be understood in multiple ways, right? Both are right, but journalists chose to frame this as one way than the other, right? It's a framing. Another example. So 2013, Obamacare. Initially, when it was passed, it wasn't that popular. Several years later, when more Americans get benefits out of it, the popularity of Obamacare went up. But initially, you can see a lot of titles here. like Obamacare's problem, or stop digging, start over, Obamacare fumble, or let's fix it, or credibility going up in smoke. So for the year that you can see those front page news or how the coverage is kind of describing Obamacare. And this is actually Gallup poll on presidential approval rating on President Obama. And you can see the drops from 52% of Americans approve him to 41%. So 11% drop over the year. And what media effect do you think it is? Any thoughts? Only one left, that is true, which is priming, right? Obama did a lot of different things, right? But out of those, Obamacare, healthcare reform was primed. And Americans use this as an example to evaluate politicians because it was primed. That's priming issues, right? And I have 3 more examples. Another one, this was a Monday front page from Chicago Tribune and Washington Post. So this is from Washington Post. It's about Hong Kong's independence protest here. This is about the impeachment, something about Ukraine. This is about corruption scandal. This is about California's governor and veterans. In Chicago Tribune's front page, you can see the impeachment again, and this is about Springfield mayor's certain decision about casino, right, and foster kids, and the most important issue for us in Chicago is weather, right? Record low weather, right? Temperature, right? So by looking at the front page between Chicago Tribune and Washington Post, what do you think that this example, the front page, is describing? Agenda setting, priming, and framing. What do you think? Yeah?
Agenda setting.
Yeah, you can easily say that it's agenda setting, right? Washington Post is more national newspapers. It's covering more international news and something or bigger. Whereas Chicago Tribune, it is very well-known newspaper, but it's a little more local touch there. And most important issue for people in Chicago could be definitely weather, right? So it was in the half of the front page. And if they didn't cover, the Chicago Tribune didn't cover Ukraine or other things, so the people who read the Chicago Tribune could know about those issues. Let me remind you 2016 presidential election. So there are several keywords you can remember. Russia, email, text, right? So every time something came up, people say Russia, people say email, people say text, or Access Hollywood, video, whatever, right? Okay, what do you think this media effects is explaining or describing? There are 2 left, framing or priming, right? Any thoughts? Priming? Yeah. Yes, I agree. It is, right? So it's if you are supporters of candidate Trump at that time, then every time you heard about certain things about Hillary Clinton, then you will just automatically think about Hillary's email. That's the primed factor that you should use to evaluate candidates, and vice versa. And if you are voters somewhat undecided, then you can think about text or Access Hollywood or fitness when you evaluate candidate Trump at that time. It's priming. And we have 1 left, right? So you can see that exact same story is covered somewhat differently, right? So there's only 1 left. So the answer is, I will just give you an answer, framing, right? But you can see how the same story is framed differently. Okay? And this one, we can see this one is money for illegals, which really simplified version of what actually story is about. And this is carefully chosen the word like scholarship, and instead of illegal, it's undocumented students. And both are true. It's way simplified version, but it is true as substance, right? But it is framed differently. And you can see, depending on which audience they are targeting, the same story could be framed differently. And why it is important? Because you need to understand in what way media could influence your opinions. And you need to be careful with the coverage that you receive and think about whether or not there was agenda setting effect or priming effect or framing effect is involved. And I could argue that as a journalist, they have to engage in those three types of media influence. They have to, because they have very limited space and time. They cannot cover entire story. They cannot provide several pages in newspaper about one issue. They can't. So they must engage in media influence, like agenda setting, framing, or priming. But problem is that many Americans are not realize that journalists could intentionally choose those type of behaviors. When we say media bias, by definition, it's pretty negative. And many reactions from Americans toward media today is centered on media bias. But there's not only political bias exists, there are different types of bias exist. So I'll explain different types of media bias, but before that, I will explain the general public's political trust in media. You can see significant drop since 1973, 1976, which means 72% of Americans says that they trust the media, which dropped significantly back in 2016, 32%. Media gained trust a little bit better, but still is about 45%. So people distrust the media, that is true. And why is that? Especially in recent years, because of social media, the media distrust become really significant phenomenon to many Americans. And part of it is because of the bias the media has. The first bias the media has is commercial bias. So probably you're familiar with those type of yellow journalism magazine, especially in the grocery aisle, near the cashier, right? It really captures your eyes, right? With bold headlines and yellow titles and really somewhat exaggerations, pictures, right? Those are yellow journalism, sensational stories, bold headlines, illustrations. Why? Because they want to make sure that you buy this story, these magazines, right? For profits. You need to remember that media is also the industry. It's a corporation. They want to make a profit out of it. The more they sell the story, the more profits they gain out of it. But yellow journalism is not just a new phenomenon. We can trace the history back to Spanish-American War during the 1890s. And some of you may saw before, but you can see the historical example of yellow journalism back then. Like you can see half of the front page is a headline, or half of the page is the pictures. And crisis at hand, like very sensational title, you can see that the profits-motivated journalism exists way before. It is not just today's problem, because you need to understand the nature of media. It's part of the market. They want profits out of it. What else? There is a corporate bias as well. This picture is from Fortune 2018, which describing media conglomerates. In America, we have only 6 large companies. They own most of media sources, news sources. And you can see that recently AT&T bought Time Warner's. So AT&T now owns CNN, and Comcast has MSNBC, NBC, etc. Disney owns ABC. CBS Corporation has CBS, and 21st Century Fox have Fox News Channel, etc., and Viacom. So there are only 6 media companies they own, from magazine to network television to other channels of media sources. And what does this figure tells us regarding corporate bias? it's pretty easy to understand the pressure, the money pressure that each media sources could feel under the parents' corporation, right? So when you're parents and you provide monthly allowance to your children, you kind of expect from your children, right? And that there's a monthly allowance, then you should do some help with dishes or whatever, right? It's not just completely free. Likewise, the parents' corporation give salaries and invests in each news sources, and in return, they want something, the benefit for the parents' corporation, which means no critical coverage about the parents' corporation, right? I mean, that's not good. I mean, when you as a kid, you get monthly allowance from your parents and you are stand up against your parents, that's not good for you, right? That happens when Disney owns ABC. Disney is one of the top American company that beloved by Americans. However, in their business practice, it's not from the criticism. There is some criticism on their business practice, right? In their somewhat sending the jobs to oversee or how they treat the unions, things like that. And some ABC anchors were critical of Disney business practice before, and when they owned the ABC, those anchors were fired. So you could see how the media corporate bias from the parents' corporation could exist. I mean, you can think of that. I mean, how can CNN be critical of AT&T's over-dominance in the market? How can they cover that when AT&T actually owns CNN, right? That's a corporate bias. And we have political bias. And many Americans were really concerned about this. And the CNN, MSNBC, or the late night talk shows are seen as very liberal, whereas Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity's are very conservative. So we have both ideological, different media sources there. And for example, Jim Acosta from CNN actually had a really confrontation in press conference with President Trump, and he was limited the access to press conference for a certain time. And those ideological differences in media use and the media coverage became the concerns of American consumers. And I will get to that point when we cover media habits. And how can we understand media effects and media bias in terms of our habits? As an audience, we have certain habits to use what kind of media we are using it and how we are using it. So I'm going to introduce the Americans' media consumptions. And the key point here is that social media become a real issue among American public. And you can see from the 2018 Pew Research Center's survey, most people said that they gain political information or news from television and news websites and radio, social media, and print newspapers. So clearly, print newspaper is decreasing. It's no longer the primary source of information for Americans. But news media and social media together becomes the larger portion of our information channel. And another important aspect you need to think about is that only within 2 years, almost 10% drop who says that they are gaining political information from television, which in turn is showing more and more people are relying on social media rather than television. And we could also understand our media habits by different factors. How about age? You can see that most audience of Covariate Report are youngest cohort, like Generation Z or millennials. Generation X, from age 30 to 49, are reading News USA Today more. And age 50 to 64 are tuning into morning news. And boomers and silent generation are listening to Sean Hannity, or it's no longer is aired, but O'Reilly Factor. So you can see by generations, the main sources of information are different. What about by gender? So currently, about 51% of American public is women, about 49% of American public is men. And when we see the share of audience in each news sources, 71% of Wall Street Journal readers are men, 73% economists readers are men. Rush Limbaugh show, which weekly audience is 13 million, 60% of them are men. Okay, then what about women? What kind of channel that women are tuning to? 62% to morning show and daytime talk show, 73%. 60% of MSNBC watchers are women. So you can see how the slightly, it's not really even slight, there is ideological differences in those channels, and the audience are different in terms of gender, and how that affects our opinions. That's pretty interesting. What about our habits by ideology? Not only in 2014 Pew Research Center survey, but 2016 survey as well. If you are Trump voters, the main sources that you are relying on was Fox News. If you are Hillary voters, they named several different sources, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, New York Times, and Washington Post. Okay? So that's pretty interesting, very different. And if you are liberal, then you are more likely to different someone on social media because of politics. But if you are conservative, you are more likely to hear political opinions similar to your own, and you like it or you share it. Different media habits. And if you are liberals, you are more likely to say that you trust the media sources. 28 out of 36 different names. But if you are conservative, you say you distrust 24 channels out of 36 news channels. So you can see more media distrust among conservatives than media distrust among liberals. And that's kind of related to the social media and proliferation of social media in recent years. And more Americans, about 2/3 of Americans says that you are gaining political information from social media like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and etc. And you can see that those social media is not kind of traditional or new media where filtering or agenda setting, framing, or priming are legitimately used by journalists. But anyone, any user can contribute to create or share the information. That's a reason why it caused more bias or inaccuracy in the news sources. And as more people are using social media as a main sources of information, it really raises concerns among American public. Like social media fatigue that you have. More and more people say that they are worn out by how many political posts and discussion they see. Especially they express stress when they have to talk about politics with someone who have different political opinions. And that social media fatigue is one of the reasons why some people say that they are not interested in politics. And this has implication on how we understand the role of media, and that really explains the distrust in media today. And especially to those who gain the information accidentally. Political scientists, especially study the political communication, argues that most Americans gain political information accidentally. You are a Packers fan, so you saw the front page of Milwaukee Journal. That's all you care, but accidentally you learn about something is going on in state budget. Something is mismanaged, right? And that's how you gain the political information. Not in depth, but just barely know about something going on. You just want to have fun on Friday night, or Saturday night, by the way, sorry about that. And you accidentally learn about something going on in White House. Or you just want to watch the Packers and Dallas Cowboys game, but you accidentally learn about that former President Bush and Ellen DeGeneres sat together, which caused political discourse about they shouldn't sit together. And that's what you gain the political information accidentally. Whether or not you agree with that argument, it actually captures a lot of Americans' media habit. For sure, that is true. And for those who receive the information accidentally, will process that information very differently from those who gain the information with a careful search. And those group of people who gain the accident information will be more vulnerable to media influence and media bias. And that's also related to our feelings about media. Regardless of the fairness in the coverage, Americans tended to think that that coverage is way too biased toward my political ideology than actually it is. So for example, if you're conservative, you believe that CNN is way too biased and too critical of President Trump, although the CNN coverage was actually pretty fair. And vice versa, if you are liberal, you just do not trust Fox News just because it's Fox News, although that Fox News coverage is relatively fair and accurately covering the information. That hostile media phenomenon is getting really increasing among American public, especially when social media became our primary sources of information. So as a closing section of my talk, I would like to introduce the Thomas Jefferson's quote in the letter. The freedom of press is so shared idea among founding fathers that he preferred newspaper without government if he have to choose. Right? So freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression are well upheld by American public. And it is actually really seen from many surveys as 3/4 of Americans believe that media is playing a role as a fourth branch of the government, as a watchdog. And they really believe in the freedom of press and the role of media. But at the same time, equal proportion of Americans also says that media is biased. But there is kind of hope. They said media is biased, but social media is more biased, and they expect that social media could be inaccurate. So the American public can kind of distinguish between social media and its nature from the other traditional type of mainstream media. And that's kind of really hopeful. And the reason why we should pay attention to what kinds of or sources of media we are getting it is critical to understand the democracy and its health, because there is very slim numbers of Americans who are highly interested in politics. Also, there are very slim numbers of Americans who are uninterested in politics at all. And majority of Americans have some sort of moderate interest in politics. And media will have greater impact on those majority Americans. Right? If you're highly interested, whether or not it's agenda set or framed, primed, you can figure out what it is, right? If you are uninterested in politics, that doesn't have any impact on you. But if you are somewhat moderately interested in politics, how media is biased or how media is presented the story or framed it will have greater impact on you. And if you are tuning to only social media, not to mainstream media, then inaccuracy or poor quality of it will definitely impact on your ideas and opinions. But I still do have hope in American public regarding how we process our information that we are getting it. So this is from the 2014 Pew Research Center survey. So in the ideological spectrum, 0 means completely neutral, +10 means conservative, and -10 means liberal. So they asked what kind of sources you are having in terms of information channel. And so many people mentioned different things. And when we evaluate those audience, you will see surprising result. You may assume that Fox News watchers are way conservative, right? But in their ideological spectrum, they are rated as +2, not 10. Although Breitbart watchers or Rush Limbaugh show listeners are rated as 6, plus 6, so they are more far conservative, but not as much as we thought of about them. And same thing happens to CNN. Here, CNN watchers are rated as somewhat about 2, -2, not -10, as many people thought about CNN audience. They are not that liberal. What does this tell about media consumption and habits? Actually, liberals watch Fox News. Actually, conservatives watch CNN. And that's pretty hopeful that not only you are stick with just one channel. I mean, there are some Americans who stick with one channel and not willing to be open to any other information sources. But unlike our assumption, there are quite many Americans are open to different sources of a channel so that they could at least gain different framing and priming effects from those channels. So as a citizens, what's our role? Being an informed citizen is critical to be a contributor to healthy democracy, right? And we need to understand the role of media and how media influence our opinions and our behavior. And we still respect media's role as a watchdog. And without media, we couldn't know how government or corporations or even church could do wrongdoing to the public, right? So the watchdog role that played by media is still very important. But in terms of social media, we don't need to be too pessimistic about it because it could be used for good reason, and it is actually. This picture is describing the sit-in protest among immigration activists. They occupied a senator's office to pressure the senator to vote for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, and they actually live streaming that sit-in protest on Facebook to promote public awareness. So social media, which can be used by any Americans, can be used for better goods and could be used wisely. So my conclusion for the talk is that it is true that proliferation of social media really raised our concerns about role of media and its bias. But let's be a little more specific when we have this discourse. I'm talking about social media or other type of traditional media. And in order to answer that question, we should be a little more clear about how it actually influences our opinions with framing, priming, and agenda setting, and how biased it is actually is. All right, let me conclude my talk, and I will open to discussions or Q&A session, anything, right? Thank you very much. So if you have any questions, just let me know. Oh, yeah. Yes, lady. Yeah.
Just back to the corporate influence and that our media is dominated by 6 corporations.
Yes.
You hear about independent journalists and independent media. Is there really such a thing, or are they all, I try to trust that, oh, this is great, here's an independent media. Is that true, or are they part of that big?
That's a really good questions. Good points. There are independent journalists, self-claimed, but they need financial support for what they are doing it, right? So they couldn't be completely independent from the sources of money that they are getting it. That is true. But if they are not part of those huge complicated diagram, then they are less of pressure from the money influence. That is true. But at the same time, because of lack of money power, they couldn't have equal access to the public or equal access to the sources or stories, maybe. Even though they were able to create really good stories for the public, it may not be delivered well because of lack of financial resources they have. And also another aspect is about let's say, public broadcasting system like NPR or WPR, right? They are public broadcasting systems so that they are more neutral, more less biased politically, but they still gain the financial support from the government and other donors and everything, right? So they are vulnerable too, and that is a reason why in every season you have, WPR always have the spring membership drive or fall membership drive every time, right? So the vulnerability is a huge issue in today's media, and which really results in poor quality of the coverage as well. Yeah, excellent questions. Yes?
What does it mean to say that I get news from social media? When I look at Facebook, I see 1 million headlines. Does that mean I'm getting news, or do I have to click a link to read an article? Is that getting news?
That's a really good question. These days, many young generations, they do not directly visit NewYorkTimes.com or FoxNews.com. They don't. They log on Facebook or YouTube or other social media, and in their news feed, somebody shared the news and somebody posted something about it, and they read mostly the title. That's it. And if you want to, few of them are going, actually click it and going into the original sources of a website. But yes, that is true that the depth of information they're getting it is too shallow, as opposed to people who are doing a really careful search. That is true. But that's actually media habits that we are facing today. And more people are doing that kind of media habits. And it's not necessarily really bad, because we often engage in those type of behavior. We want to use information shortcut too, right? When you vote for someone, I mean, we are not spending like tens of hours to study candidates, right? We don't. We rely on party name, right? We rely on candidates' race or gender or age, right? We do sometimes. Likewise, people who are relying on those Facebook newsfeed and the clickbait type of title can be still some sort of information as well. Yeah, unfortunate situation, but yes.
So I'm one of those people that you would say is highly interested in politics. I have a political science degree.
Mm-hmm.
But in my own social media experience, you were talking about yellow journalism and bias. And in my own social media experience, there are people on both ends of the spectrum that will share these articles from websites that make no secret about their bias.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that what they're writing is conservative and they're shouting it from the rooftops, or what they're writing is liberal and they're shouting it from the rooftops, and people are sharing it because it echoes, you know, because it plays into that echo chamber of what they believe. And, you know, so, you know, I guess my question is, you know, what impact does that have when people are, you know, they're seeing these, a conservative is seeing these conservative websites that are have no problem saying we're uber conservative, or vice versa, and then that's being shared and proliferated. You know, what impact does that have? Is my question.
That's a really good question, and probably capture most Americans concerned about these days, right? The one thing that I can say is brought from the history that FCC used to regulate the media to require fairness doctrine from the media sources, which if you cover one candidate from one party, then you should spend same fair time to opposite parties' candidates. Make sure that public is aware of both different aspects of issues or candidates. But it's no longer used because the government or people have a consensus that we do not need a fairness doctrine anymore, because there are plenty of channels that different aspects of opinions can be available to everyone, right? Right? And social media even make more available those type of different issues. But the problem is that you are just looking at one ideological information channels, and you can even hide the news feed from somebody else in your, even though they are friends, if they have different political views, you hide them or you unfriend them, right? So you just stick with one channel. That's most concerning, right? And there is, it's quite kind of recent kind of phenomenon, so that the scholars are really investigating about that impact, do not have consensus in terms of research, but still some scholars argue that Americans are able to, majority of Americans are able to understand inaccuracy of the information they are receiving. They could carefully evaluate the quality of information they are getting it. But your concern is also very valid, that many Americans are stick with one information than the other. That is also concerning too. I'm not sure if I answered your questions, but do not have some kind of answer for that. Okay. Yes?
I guess one of my concerns is you constantly hear that the liberal is biased to the left. And I remember many years ago reading a study of students who were involved in media study did have a tendency to lean left from a political perspective or ideological perspective. But, you know, I look at the companies that own the media, and I know that, you know, between every reporter who has framed a story and has written a story, there stands an editor who decides whether or not that story gets any kind of exposure to the public. And in back of the editor stands a corporation that's trying to make money. So, you know, I always have this concern, am I really hearing, you know, honestly about the media? Is it biased right? Is it biased left? I'm sure some are both. But, you know, where does the ultimate decision, who does the ultimate decision on what news we get, where does it come from? Does it come from the reporter, the editor, or whoever hires the editor?
That's really good questions. Could it be somewhat varied depending on which media outlets we are talking about? Could it be cable network or just mainstream news magazines or newspapers? Could it depending on what kind of channels we're talking about? But mainly, it is determined by editors who are under serious pressure from their parents' corporation. Many journalists now outcrying for lack of independency or discretions for how they report or cover the stories. And you can say that if the media is liberally leaning or conservatively leaning, then editors will share pretty much similar viewpoints in decision how to frame the story or how to prime the story, probably. But if it is way too liberal leaning or conservative leaning, then editor will stop that further framing or priming efforts by the journalists or individual reporters. So the concerns from the people who actually work in the journalism is the money influence is greater these days. And back to your original questions about the somewhat shared kind of images about liberal, so-called liberal bias. And the question is where that comes from. Could it be the nature of the media's role as a watchdog itself? So as a watchdog, they are always being critical of the current administration or majority party, and being critical of or always finding something wrongdoing is seen as liberal in some people's view. And that can kind of answer your first part of the questions. Okay. Yes?
It seems to me that you have this conglomeration, you have the changing habits of how people consume, you know, local TV, they don't have TV anymore. seems like local and state politics are ones that are being left out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that we have people who might be more informed on the national issues than the local. Can you speak at all to
That's-
detrimental effects?
That's really good questions. I taught the politics of media in few semesters ago, and we actually covered local news and that its impact to state and local level politics too. An excellent point. Our discourse is really centered on national media and its impact at the national level. And quite many Americans still saying that they tune into local television news for local political news and information. That is true. The state and local politics is the main news source is local television, and many Americans tune into local TV for not political issues but social issues, such as what happened, what's the crime rate, or what happened my neighborhood, or what's the weather like tomorrow, things like that. So there's two different kind of aspects about this fact that still television become the primary sources for many Americans for local level information, but that is pretty limited as local news channel is very limited in terms of its depth of coverage. They just merely cover the fact and they are not engaging in analysis of it. So the information that people at the local level or state level are getting it is really simplified version of this fact without any analysis, which left them to process that information with their own predisposed ideology. So that can be somewhat limited impact to local and state media impact in terms of media. Excellent questions. Yes.
Time for one more question?
Yes. Final questions?
You know, a lot of people will refer to, like, they see something in social media, and then they'll comment, oh, I checked with Snopes. And it says, do you know how accurate Snopes is?
How accurate it is, which I do not have enough data to tell that to confirm the accuracy of that fact-checking kind of sources. And even though that NPR is doing fact-checking, still certain segments of population do not buy it. So what I can say is that there are people who are aware of inaccurate information out there, or unsubstantiated information is circulated. They're aware of it, and they try to check with third-party sources, which is positive kind of phenomenon that we are facing. Although there could be two different sources of fact-checking sources for liberals and conservative, unfortunately. But I see it as more positive aspects of American public's higher level of awareness about current landscape because of the social media. But that's really interesting questions, and I need to look at further data on fact-checking sources. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark.
Thank you very much for your time. Yeah, thank you.